So let's start this lesson by opening up 02 Storm Tracker logo start.aep. Just double click on that. And in the examples folder, I want you to double click on the Storm Tracker logo.mov. And we're going to preview this and just discuss a little bit what we're going to learn in this lesson. So let's press play. So the first thing we're going to do is actually design our text animation. The second thing we're going to do is create our 7 logo. And the last thing we'll do is create our extrusion for our logo. We can stop this from playing, and let's close this. Let's toggle collapse the examples folder, and let's begin the lesson. So let's go up to composition and create a new composition. I want you to name this text. You'll use the preset NTSC DV and a duration of 5 seconds. Let's click OK. The next thing we need to do is type out our storm. So select the text tool, and I'm actually going to switch from the standard workspace to the text workspace. I'm also going to stretch this down just a little bit so we can see a little bit more of our composition window. And let's start typing. So click once, and let's type storm in all capitals. S-T-O-R-M. And we can drag that to the center. And let's make sure we have a couple of things before we move on. So the font needs to be impact. The type size, let's set that to about 75. So I'm going to highlight this again. Let's just type in 75. The text height and the text width, make sure both of those are on 100. And your tracking should be at 0, and your paragraph should be centered. If you want, you can tighten up the kerning a little bit by holding down the Option key, or on the PC, the Alt key, and using the left and right arrow. So I can tighten that up just a hair, or loosen that up if I need to. Actually, I'm just going to tighten up the R and the M. Let's get our Move tool, and let's move on. So I'm going to stretch up the timeline a little bit because I want to make some changes in the scale and in the position. So to do that, easy shortcuts, P for position, holding down Shift, S for scale. So let's move our position to about 300. Actually be faster just to type it if you want. And on our Y position, let's set that to 240. And we're going to want this a lot larger, so I'm going to change the scale. Let's break the chain because I'm going to want this wider than it is taller. And in the X value, let's put that to 215. And in the Y value, let's set that to 175. Now we'll also want to convert this layer to 3D. So under the cube, let's just click that. That'll convert it to 3D, and you can see we have our X, Y, and Z positioning. Let's collapse this. Now the fun part, animating the text. So I want you to toggle this open one more time and toggle collapse the transforms. And under text, we're going to go and toggle open animate. And I want you to locate scale. So by doing that, we've brought in the scale range selector. And I actually want you to rename this. By default, they come in as Animator 1, and if you put another one, they'll put Animator 2. I want you to click on that, hit return, and name this scale. Actually, easier so that we don't get it confused with the transform, let's call it text scale. And let's add a keyframe at the beginning. So we'll drop a keyframe in there, and we'll set that to 0. So basically it disappears. Then let's move down on the timeline to about 1 second. Okay, so we're 1 second on the timeline, and we're going to increase the scale to about 200. Now this is the neat part of animating the type as opposed to animating the transform. If I was to animate the transform right now, it would increase the size of the object. Now animating the type, I'm actually animating each character individually. So you can see as they get smaller, they spread apart, and as they get larger, they start connecting together. So we're just going to set this to 200. So let's move down the timeline a little bit, and I'm just going to scrub on the time code till I get to about 115. And let's set our range selector back down to 100. Okay, and if we scrub on this, we can see our animation. Starts from nothing, comes up to 200, and then just drops back down to 100. Now, I want to smooth this out a little bit. So what I'm going to do is actually change the velocity on this center keyframe. And we can do this really easy with the new feature in 7 by going to our graph editor. So by selecting a graph editor, you can see the velocity is pretty sharp turn here. So if I want to soften this, there's a little shortcut right here that'll smooth out the Bezier handles, and all I have to do is click. So now my motion is very smooth going through these 3 keyframes. And that's all I have to do. Let's click back outside of the graph editor, and we can test this. So hitting 0 on the numeric keypad will give us our RAM preview. And we have a nice smooth motion going into our keyframes. Let's go and adjust where our grouping alignment is for our type. Because right now, everything's happening at the access point, or the XYZ handles here. So to change that, we're going to go under More Options, and we're going to change the grouping alignment. Let's stretch this out a little bit. And I'm actually going to move in a little bit further down the timeline so you can see how the grouping alignment works before I set in my keyframes. So the grouping alignment is basically just moving our anchor point. So I can move this anywhere I want, and this will change how the animation responds. So let's set some actual keyframes for this. So at 0 on the timeline, I want you to set the first property to 0 and the second property to 50. Let's put a keyframe there, and let's move down to about 1 second. And let's set that so the grouping alignment moves down. You can stop at -80. Okay, so that'll center it. And we'll also want to change the velocity here. So a shortcut for doing that is to right-click on the keyframe and just go to Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease In. So this will ease the velocity going into this keyframe. So now we have a nice movement where the type comes lower, then comes up, and then drops down. So let's go and move on to the next part. Let's toggle collapse the storm layer, deselect it, select our text tool, and type in the word tracker in all lowercase. Okay, let's center this. And we're going to want to change this font. So let's just highlight this and change some of our characters. So the first thing, it needs to be Arial. So let's just type in Arial, hit return. The next thing we're going to want to do is change the font size. So from 75, let's change that to 48. So let's select our Move tool, and we're going to change the position and the scale. So P for position, hold down Shift, and S for scale. Let's change the scale first. Let's break the chain off of the scale properties, and let's change the width to 220, and let's change the height to 175. Now, I want you to move down the timeline to about 115. And we're going to set a position property in there for 360 by 300. Actually, so much faster for me if I just type this, 360, 300. So this way the K is just touching the R. And let's set a keyframe in for that. Let's go to the end of the timeline and hitting the End key, and we're just going to drag that across. So using your X position, you can just scrub onto that so it goes to the beginning of the R. Now I'm going to go back to my keyframe at 115. I'm going to use my arrow tool right here just to toggle back to my keyframe, because I'm going to want to space this a little bit more so it starts at this end of the R. So let's say 380. So let's just scrub through to see this movement so that it travels from one side of the R to the other side of the R. Okay, I'm going to go back to the beginning of the timeline, and we're going to start animating the text. So let's toggle collapse the tracker and toggle it open one more time, close down transform, and let's go to animate. Let's go and open up animate, go down to tracking, and I want you to select off of tracking because we only want to put a keyframe in the tracking amount, and let's set some keyframes. So let's go to 1 second on the timeline and set the tracking to 100. So this will spread out our text pretty far. Actually, I'm just going to type that in and set a keyframe. Let's go to 115 now on the timeline and set that to 0. If we scrub, we can see the tracking coming in and out. In fact, I'm going to turn off the storm layer so we can just see the tracker layer. So this is what we have. Let's add another property to this. So I'm going to animate the scale property. So let's go animate, scale, and we're going to turn the scale to 0 so it just disappears. We can just type in 0. Makes it a little bit easier. Set a keyframe and go to 115 and set that to 100. So it tracks from nothing, comes up, and then slides across. We also want to make sure that this tracking comes in pretty smoothly. So I'm going to select my keyframes, right-click, Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease In, so we have a nice eased movement or eased velocity into our keyframe. Now, same thing that we did before, I'm going to change the naming convention off of my animators. So let's just call this text track. Let's call animator 2 text scale. So let's collapse those. And let's turn on the storm layer. And let's preview what we have. So select the composition window, pressing the tilde key, and hitting 0 on the numeric keypad. So now we've designed our text, and we can move on. So let's click on the composition window, select the tilde key to reset that, stretch this down a little bit, toggle collapse tracker and storm, and we'll start working on our 7 logo. So what I want you to do is create a new solid, so layer new solid. I want you to name this ring, and I want you to put it to comp size, 720 by 480, and let's make sure that it is white. So going to the color picker, just drag it all the way up to the upper left-hand corner to white, click OK again. Let's go and move up to our elliptical mask tool, and starting from the upper left corner, just drag down, holding down the Shift key to constrain this, and let's make a circle. I'm going to get my Move tool and just center this a little bit. I'm actually going to turn on my title safe and guides. Stretch this out a little bit so I can use this to make sure I center this. So right about there. The next thing I need to do is actually cut a hole in the middle of this white circle. So what I'm going to do is duplicate the mask. So selecting the ring, I'm going to type M for mask. I'm going to select the mask shape and Command D. That'll get me a new mask. I'm going to set the new mask to subtract, which will actually cut a hole in the mask, and then I'm going to double click on the top node, grab the corner node, and holding down Shift, just going to constrain that and center these so that I've made a ring. Now my ring is done, I can go and start with creating the 7. So let's go to our text tool, type in 7. I'm going to go to my Move tool, position this. I'm going to change my font from Arial to Arial Black, and all I need to do now is scale this. I'm holding down the Shift key to constrain the scaling, and let's just move this around. Actually, move it to the bottom since it's scaling from this anchor point. Stretch this up till it fits right about there. And then I'm also going to scale it on the width. To right about there. I'm going to turn off my title safe guides. And the next thing I want to make sure of is we can see that the 7's a little off white. So I want to make sure that's white. So I'm just going to click in this little gray box and the same thing. Just drag that up to make sure it's completely white so it blends in. And what we're going to have to do is cut off this little edge right here. So I can go back to my mask tool. And let's just stretch this out. I'm going to go to my Move tool. Just double click. Stretch this so it connects here. Drag down so it connects to the bottom. Drag out a little bit to the left. And that should be perfect. And go back to my 7 and my ring, holding down Shift, and select both of these. Because now I want to pre-compose these so I can work with them as one file. So Layer, Pre-compose, and we'll just call this 7. Let's click OK. And now we're working with one layer. Okay, let's move down the timeline to 125. So 125, 1 second and 25 frames. And I'm actually going to turn off the eyeball for tracker and storm. So I'm just working with the 7 right now. And we're going to add some blur effects to this. So I'm going to switch my workspace from text to effects. And I'm just going to type in fast blur. So here is my fast blur effect. I can just drag that onto the 7. And let's set the blurriness to 25. And let's set a keyframe there. Now, I want you to move down the timeline to 2 seconds and 5 frames. So you can either drag across or type it in. And I want you to set the blurriness to 0. So this is what we have. We have a blurred 7 that comes in. And what we're going to do, this is going to be how the 7 transitions in our logo. I want you to type the letter U so you can see the keyframes. And we're going to also add some transparency to this. So holding down Shift, I'm going to type in the letter T to add the opacity or transparency setting. I'm going to set a keyframe and bring that down to 0. I'm going to bounce over to the next keyframe, and let's set that back to 100. So this is what we have. Dissolves in, a little bit blurry, and then comes in opaque and solid. Okay, let's turn the eyeballs back on for Storm Tracker, and let's reposition the 7 so it looks like it's part of the Storm Tracker logo. So I'm going to select P for position and S for scale. Scale this down a little bit. Reposition it. Pull the scale in a little bit more. So I would say probably a safe bet. Scale set to 40, and then just move that to the side. I'm holding down the Shift key to constrain the positioning. So it's right about here. Now, before we move any forward, let's make sure that all of our layers are in 3D, because we're going to have to move these in 3D space in a little while. So we'll set that up now. So let's move to the beginning of the timeline, and let's create a new null object. Layer new null object. And I'm going to want you to name this null object. So let's select the null object, select return, and call it logo control. Okay. So what the null object is, it's an invisible object that we can use to parent all of the other layers to. So we're going to take 7, Tracker, and Storm and parent that to the logo control or the null object so that we can move them all using just one set of controls. I want you to make sure the logo control is in 3D, and let's open our parent control. So if you right-click up here and go to Columns, Parent, you'll see our parent controls. I want you to select 7, Tracker, and Storm, and where it says None, I just want you to toggle that open and select Logo Control. So now the logo control moves all of our objects. So let's hit R for rotation, and I just want to show you an example of this. I'm going to move somewhere in the middle of the timeline, about 215. So I have X, Y, and Z rotation controls. If I scrub on my X rotation, you can see I start rotating the logo towards us. If I scrub on my Y rotation, rotates around the Y axis. And if I scrub on the Z rotation, it rotates around the Z axis. Let's set these all back to 0. Let's go back to the beginning of the timeline, and we're going to adjust the X, Y, and Z rotation. So the X rotation, we're going to set that to -25. The Y rotation, we're going to set that to 25. And the Z rotation, we're going to set that to 25. I want you to put keyframes for all of those. If we drag down, you can see our logo is in perspective. At the end of the timeline, hit the End key to get there. I just want you to put in the opposite settings for the numbers we have right now. So -25 becomes 25, 25 becomes -25, and 25 becomes -25. And this is what we end up with. Now I also want you to change the anchor point for this so that it moves a little bit more to the left. So let's go to about 215. And I just want you to select the A key, that's the shortcut for anchor point, and all we need to adjust is the X positioning. So let's just move that to the side. Let's put it at 42. So let's hit return, and that centers that up. We'll scroll on that a little bit, see what we're getting. Okay, our logo is coming outside of our composition window, so we're going to adjust the positioning a little bit as well. So let's go to 1 second on the timeline. Hit P for position, and let's set the X position to 340. Let's set the Z position to -100. This will move it towards the composition window. So let's drag on that. Let's set a keyframe there. And now let's go to the end of the timeline, and let's change the position. So let's change the X position. We'll bring that in a little bit. Let's put it to 390. And we'll also change the Y position. Let's change that to about 275, see what that looks like. And let's change the Z position so that it moves further away from us. Let's go a little bit extreme. We'll go to 600. Just going to scrub on that to test this. And I'm going to click the composition window, hit the tilde key, hit 0 on the numeric keypad to preview this so we can see what we have. Okay, now that we're happy with our animation, we can go and start colorizing it. So you can hit any key on your keyboard to stop this, hit the tilde key, and let's go up to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. I'm going to want you to rename the adjustment layer, so let's rename that Colorize. Hit Return, and let's move somewhere into the middle of the timeline. I'm also going to collapse Logo Control, and let's add the ramp effect to our Colorize layer. So under Effects and Presets, I'm just going to type in Ramp, and we're going to drag the ramp effect onto Colorize. Now, the ramp effect is basically a gradient ramp that we can animate. So we have the start of the ramp, which is this target here. You can see that changes the gradient for us. We have the end of the ramp, that is this target here. And what we're going to do here is we're going to actually fake 3D lighting. If we were in a 3D program, what we would have to do is actually put a light in here. But we're going to use the ramp to kind of create a highlight around our 7, and that'll drop off going towards our S. So I want you to go to your start color, and let's start by changing this. So click on the black box, and let's get a nice yellowish orange color. If we just want to dial in the colors, let's select the red color and put in 225. Let's select the green color and put 190. And let's select the blue color and put in 110. Now this is very important. What I'm doing here is I'm selecting a yellow that is going more towards the red color spectrum. If I go more towards the green color spectrum, there's a greater chance that I'll run into NTSC unsafe colors. So my thing is to always go and favor towards the red. Let's click OK. You'll see that's the start of our ramp. Let's go and change the end color. And again, we can just dial these in into the RGB values. So select red and put in 205. Select green, put in 135. Select the blue and put in 20. Again, favoring the red instead of the green. Now, let's move our start of ramp towards the 7 and our end of ramp towards the S. And this is just to give you an idea of this is where the highlight will be. Now, let's move to the beginning of the timeline. And we're actually going to reposition our start of ramp and our end of ramp. Okay, so let's go and reposition our start of ramp to about here. And let's take our end of ramp and put it down here. Let's set keyframes for those. Start of ramp, end of ramp. And let's go to the end of the timeline. I'm just hitting the end key. And I'm going to take my start of ramp and put it on the 7. And I'm going to take my end of ramp and move it towards the S. So this way, the light seems to be coming off of the 7 and then gradiating out towards the S. You can kind of scrub on this to kind of give you an idea what's going on. So the light starts from the S and then moves towards the 7. Let's preview that so you can get a better idea of this. Select the composition window, tilde key, 0 on the numeric keypad, and we end up with our colorized logo treatment. Let's hit any key to stop this. Let's hit the tilde key to reduce the size. I want you to go back to your standard workspace, and I'm going to want you to duplicate the text composition. So select Text, Command D to duplicate, hit Return, and let's name this Text Extrude. Double click on it. Let's move to the beginning of the timeline, and let's make some changes. I want you to select the Colorize adjustment layer, and let's rename this Extrude. So select Return and type in Extrude. I also want you to toggle this open And under Effects, delete the ramp, because we're going to add a new effect to this. So in your workspace, switch from Standard to Effects, and I want you to type in under Effects and Presets, Directional Blur. Drag Directional Blur onto the Extrude layer, and we're going to set some Directional Blur to this. So let's just go again back into the middle so I can show you what Directional Blur is going to do for us. The Directional Blur, we can change the angle of our blur, and we can also change the blur length. So we're going to do a couple of steps to try and get an extrusion by doing this. Just set this back to 0 and 0. And let's go back to the beginning of the timeline. Okay, at the beginning of the timeline, I want you to change the direction to -11, so it has a slight angle, and I want you to change the blur length to 10. Let's set keyframes for that. Let's move to 215 on the timeline, and let's set the blur length to 2 and the direction to 0. Let's go to the end of the timeline. At the end of the timeline, let's set the blur length to 10. All right, now if we scrub on this, we can see we have this blur. So let's go and add a levels effect to this. So under Effects and Presets, let's type in Level, and drag the Levels effects down to the Extrude layer, and let's move to about 215, so actually somewhere where we can actually see the blur. Let's say 22 frames should be fine. And all I want you to do is to switch the channel from RGB to alpha. This way we'll affect the alpha channel of our text. And let's drag down on the white levels until our alpha channel becomes solid. So I would say a safe place is right about here. So now we have a solid alpha channel, and we can go in and scrub on this again so we can get an idea of what this is going to look like. Looks okay. Go back to the beginning of the timeline, and now let's add another ramp effect. So under the Effects and Presets, let's just type in ramp, drag the ramp onto the Extrude layer, and the same thing as before, we're going to change the start color and the end color. So under the start color, let's get a nice brown color here, kind of brown gold color, right about there. And actually, let me go back there so you can see the RGB values. Let's use 160, 85, and 15. Now on our end color, we'll make that a little bit darker. Let's pull that up to about there. And let's use, let's say, 115, 50, and 10. And click OK. Now if we drag down, we can kind of get an idea of what our color is going to be. Now we don't have to animate these. Just want you to move the start of ramp to about here and the end of ramp to about there. So let's just drag on this. And that should be fine. Let's toggle collapse some of these effects. And we're going to add one last effect onto this and then combine these two layers. So the next effect that we're going to add is a simple choker. And what the simple choker will do is cut into the alpha channel a little bit for us. So let's just drag the simple choker down onto the extrude, and we're going to set this. Let's go to the center here so you can kind of see what simple choker does. Let's go to about 1 second. If I drag on simple choker, see if I drag it to the negative, it increases the alpha channel. If I drag it to the positive, I can actually get rid or cut into the alpha channel. We're only going to go in very slightly at 1. And that'll just cut in a little bit around our alpha channel, make sure it's clean. Let's switch from the effects mode to the standard mode, because I want to see my compositions to combine them. Okay, let's create a new composition, and let's call this Storm Tracker Logo. And the preset, again, will be NTSC DV, and our duration 5 seconds. Let's click OK. I want you to grab Text Extrude, drag that onto the timeline. I want you to grab Text and drag that onto the timeline as well above Text Extrude. If we drag this down, scrub, we can see they're lined up. So the next thing we have to do is just reposition Text Extrude so that it seems like it's the extrusion or the 3D extrusion for the Storm Tracker logo. Let's go to the beginning of the timeline, hit P for position, and we're going to dial in some numbers here. So in the beginning, I want you to set a keyframe and type in 360 by 243. I want you to go to 1 second on the timeline, and let's plug in 360 by 253. I want you to go to 2 seconds on the timeline, and let's type in, you know what? Let's eyeball this, because that's more fun, actually. Let's stretch this out. Move that around right about there. We'll move another second down the timeline. So let's go to 3 seconds and move this right here. Let's go to 4 seconds and we'll start moving this up. So right about there. And let's go to the end of the timeline and reposition this right about there. Now, we can preview this. We might have to adjust this a little bit, but let's preview it and see how far off we are. So hit the tilde key, hit 0 on your numeric keypad. Let's see what we get. And as you can see, we get a nice 3D feel from doing the extrusion and adding those effects onto it. Again, we could tighten this up just a little bit in the beginning. So let's go back, hit the tilde key, stretch this out just a little bit. And I could see going from the beginning, I can take the text extrude and just reposition it slightly. So I'm going to change the X position just a little bit and change the Y position just a little bit. And I'm actually going to get rid of my first keyframe and drag that back down. There, that's better. We'll go to 1 second. I can adjust that slightly. And you can just scrub through, and anywhere you see that it's not hitting exactly, you can adjust that. At 3 seconds, I'm going to move that a little bit up. 4 seconds, it looks good. And that should be more than enough. So we're basically done with this lesson. The only thing we have to do is I want to make sure that I make an extra 7 for our next lesson. So let's do that now. I want to stretch this out a little bit. I want you to select the 7 logo, and I want you to duplicate this. Command D. And let's rename this 7 large. Just hit return, double click on it. The only thing I want you to do is change the composition settings. So let's go composition settings. I want you to take it off the lock aspect ratio, and I want you to change the width and the height. So the width will be 1000 and the height will also be 1000. Let's select OK. So let's go and reduce the size of the 7 and the ring. And to make this a little bit easier, so we don't have to scale these both, let's parent the 7 to the ring. Let's hit S for scale, and let's just drag this down to about 55. Composition, save frame as file. Let's hit the tilde key to increase the size of this. I have one that was already in there. We don't want to render that. Our current settings are set to best and full. Let's click OK. Our Photoshop settings are set to Photoshop with an RGB and an alpha. Let's click OK. And we'll want to name this 7 logo. Hit save, hit render, and we have our PSD. We can close that. Let's hit the tilde key, get everything back to where it was. We can close 7 large, and we can go ahead and now render the Storm Tracker logo. Let's increase the size of this a little bit. Just going to drag this to the beginning. Composition, make movie, hit the tilde key again to get this full size. I'm going to delete my last render. And I just want to show you in the output module what we're going to need here to make sure that we have the alpha channel. So under Format Options, make sure under your compressor where it says Depth that you have it millions of colors plus. What that means is it will have the RGB plus the alpha channel. Select OK, make sure you have it named Storm Tracker logo, and hit render. And that's it for this lesson.